I remember the first night I slept in the basement because it was the night I realized I had lost my father. The air was damp, the mattress smelled like mildew, and the only light came from a bare bulb that flickered like it was struggling to stay alive, much like the last bit of hope I had that my dad would stand up for me. I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the muffled laughter coming from upstairs, the warmth of family life carrying on without me. Josh and Emma, Linda's perfect children, were probably snuggled up in their soft beds, wrapped in thick blankets, sleeping peacefully in the rooms that used to be mine. The injustice of it all burned in my chest, but what hurt the most was knowing my father had let it happen. He had told me it was temporary, just until they got settled in. But that was 6 months ago, and now, whenever I brought it up, Linda would roll her eyes and say I was being dramatic. The worst part wasn't even the cold or the isolation. It was the way they acted like I didn't exist. Meals were cooked for 3, not 4. Conversations at the dinner table flowed around me like I was invisible. My father, once a man who would ruffle my hair and call me champ, barely even looked at me anymore. If I needed new clothes, I had to use my own money. If Josh wanted a new video game, Dad would buy it without a second thought. Emma got a brand new phone for her birthday. I got a second-hand jacket Linda found at a thrift store, a size too small. One evening, as I sat at the edge of the old mattress, rubbing my hands together for warmth, I heard them upstairs laughing. My father's deep chuckle, Linda's exaggerated giggle, Josh and Emma chiming in like they were one perfect, happy family. I wasn't a part of it. I hadn't been for a long time. Something inside me snapped. I stormed upstairs, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms, and as I reached the dining room, I saw them all sitting around the table, plates full of steaming food, the smell of roasted chicken and buttery mashed potatoes filling the air, a stark contrast to the cold sandwich I had eaten alone downstairs. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Why is it that there's always enough food for everyone except me? Linda sighed, setting down her fork with exaggerated patience, and looked at my father like he needed to control his unruly pet. "We figured you ate already," she said in that sickly sweet voice she always used when she wanted to seem reasonable, but I knew better. "I live here too," I shot back, my voice rising. "Or did you forget?" Josh smirked, cutting into his chicken with a lazy flick of his knife. "Dude, chill. There's leftovers in the fridge." "Leftovers?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's all I ever get, isn't it?" I turned to my father, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Dad, do you even see what's happening here?" He rubbed his temples, avoiding my eyes. "It's not a big deal, son. You're making it one." My stomach twisted. "Not a big deal? I sleep in the basement, Dad. Your wife treats me like I'm some stray you took in out of pity. Your stepkids get everything, and I get nothing. How is that not a big deal?" Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, please. You're acting like we threw you out onto the street." I turned to her, my vision blurring with fury. "You might as well have." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. My father pushed his plate away, his jaw tightening. "Enough." "No," I snapped, stepping closer. "You don't get to tell me to stop when you're the one who let this happen." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "You promised me, Dad. After Mom died, you said you'd always take care of me, that I'd always have a place in this house." For the first time in months, he looked at me, really looked at me, and in that moment, I saw the guilt flicker across his face, but it wasn't enough. He wasn't going to change anything. He wasn't going to fight for me. He was too tired, too beaten down, too cowardly to stand up to Linda, and maybe, deep down, he didn't want to. My father let out a slow breath, his voice heavy. "You're almost 18, he said. "Maybe it's time you start thinking about moving out." Something inside me shattered. Linda smiled, sipping her wine like she had just won a battle. Josh and Emma went back to eating, as if nothing had happened, as if I wasn't standing there, breaking apart in front of them. I turned on my heel and walked out, but as I made my way back to the basement, I realized something. They didn't expect me to fight back. They thought they had one. I didn't go to school the next day. I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my father's words pressing down on my chest like a boulder. Maybe it's time you start thinking about moving out. He said it so casually, like it was inevitable, like I was just some temporary inconvenience they were waiting to be rid of. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I wasn't some orphan they had taken in out of charity. This was my house. My mother had lived here. My childhood was built inside these walls, and now I was being told I didn't belong. Around noon, when I finally dragged myself upstairs, the house was empty. I opened the fridge and saw a plate wrapped in plastic, leftovers. A half-eaten piece of chicken, some wilted green beans, and a single scoop of mashed potatoes, like an afterthought. I slammed the fridge door shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. This was their way of telling me exactly where I stood. As I turned around, my eyes landed on Linda's purse, sitting on the counter. My hands clenched into fists, my mind racing. I had nothing, no savings, no car, nowhere to go. But Linda? Linda had everything. She had taken my house, my father, my life, and now she was waiting for me to disappear. The thought came suddenly, sharp and dangerous. If they want me gone so badly, maybe I should take something from them first. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her wallet. It was a small act of defiance, a silent way of saying, I'm still here. But just as I unzipped it, the front door swung open. Linda stood there, her eyes narrowing, and in that moment, I knew. This war was just getting started. The second Linda's eyes landed on the wallet in my hand, her entire face twisted into something smug, like she had been waiting for this moment, like she wanted to catch me doing something so she could twist it against me. She stepped forward and let the door slam behind her, standing there with her arms crossed while I stood frozen, the weight of the wallet in my fingers suddenly feeling heavier, even though I hadn't even taken anything out. There was nothing inside that I wanted, nothing she had that I cared about, but that wouldn't matter, because I already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Her voice was sharper than usual, controlled but laced with that artificial disappointment she always forced when she wanted to make herself seem like the victim. Well. I knew you were ungrateful, but I didn't think you'd start stealing from the woman who puts food on your plate. I set the wallet back down on the counter, my movements slow. Not because I felt guilty, but because I knew if I said the wrong thing, she'd twist it, turn it into something bigger than it was. My father would come home, she'd give him some rehearsed sob story, and I'd be the villain, because that's how it always worked. I forced my voice to stay calm, even though my jaw was tight and my stomach was clenched so hard it hurt. I wasn't stealing. I was going to see if there was any cash so I could go buy groceries, because unless I'm mistaken, you didn't bother to get anything for me again. Linda's expression didn't change, but I saw the slight movement in her lips, the way she was processing my words, adjusting her approach, preparing whatever lie she was going to tell my father. She shook her head, sighing dramatically, like I was some reckless child acting out for attention. You really have no shame, do you? You eat the food in this house, you sleep under this roof, and you still act like you're some kind of victim. No one owes you anything, least of all me. The way she spoke, the way she looked at me, like she had completely erased the fact that this was my home before she even existed, made something boil inside me. I had spent months keeping quiet, swallowing down the anger, letting them push me further and further out, but in that moment, standing there in the kitchen that used to feel like mine, listening to her rewrite reality to make herself the hero, I felt something crack. I leaned forward slightly, my hands pressing against the counter, my voice steady but sharp. That's where you're wrong. You took everything from me, and you act like I should be thanking you for it. Linda scoffed, reaching into her purse to pull out her phone, scrolling for a few seconds before she turned the screen toward me. It was my father's contact, the call button highlighted like a threat. You know, I think it's about time your father and I had a little talk about what a burden you're becoming. Maybe it's time to stop pretending you belong here. I should have felt scared, but I didn't. There was nothing left for me to lose. If she wanted to play this game, I wasn't going to sit back and let her win. I straightened up, shoving my hands into my pockets, forcing a smirk I didn't feel. Go ahead. Call him. Tell him whatever story you've been rehearsing in that pathetic little head of yours. But you and I both know it doesn't matter what actually happened, because he's going to take your side like he always does. So do it. Let's see if you finally convince him to get rid of me. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked almost like hesitation, because she wasn't expecting me to push back. She wasn't expecting me to stand there, call her bluff, act like I didn't care. She stared at me for a long second, her finger hovering over the screen, and I saw the way she was recalculating, realizing that she didn't need to call my father, not yet, because she had already planted the seed. She didn't need proof, just the suggestion, just the idea that I was becoming a problem, and my father would take care of the rest. She smirked, shaking her head like she pitied me, like I was pathetic. You really don't know when to quit, do you? She turned and walked away, leaving the wallet on the counter, her heels clicking against the floor with every slow, calculated step. I stood there, watching as she disappeared down the hallway, knowing exactly what was going to happen next, knowing that my father would come home in a few hours, exhausted from work, already frustrated, and she'd wait until the right moment, until he was just tired enough to believe her without question. And then, just like that, I'd be the problem again. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and walked out the front door without another word, my entire body buzzing with anger. I didn't have anywhere to go, no friends I could call, no plan, but I couldn't stay in that house, not right now, not when I could already feel the walls closing in. The cold air hit my face the second I stepped outside, but it felt better than the suffocating weight of being inside that house. I walked down the street, hands shoved into my pockets, my breath coming out in sharp clouds, trying to think, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. The realization hit me then, something so obvious that I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. If my father wanted me gone, if Linda wanted me out of the way, then maybe I should stop fighting for a place that didn't exist anymore. Maybe I should finally let them have what they wanted. But if I was going to leave, I wasn't going to do it quietly. I turned on my heel and started walking back toward the house, my heart pounding harder with every step, my mind racing through every possibility, every loose end that I needed to tie up before I left. There was still one thing I needed to do, something I should have done a long time ago. Linda thought she had won, that she had pushed me out, erased me from the family, but she forgot one important thing. I knew more about that house, about the things she kept hidden, than she realized. If she wanted me gone, fine, but I was taking something with me first. The moment I stepped back inside, I could hear Linda talking on the phone in the living room, her voice low but controlled, the kind of tone she used when she wanted to sound calm and rational, like she was the victim in whatever fake story she was telling. I didn't need to hear the full conversation to know exactly what she was saying, how she was already spinning the situation in her favor, twisting the truth just enough so that by the time my father got home, his mind would already be made up. She didn't even need to lie outright, just plant enough doubt, enough concern, enough fake worry about how I was becoming uncontrollable, how she was doing her best, but I was so angry all the time, how she was really starting to worry about how I was acting lately. That was her game. She never made accusations outright. She just laid the foundation and let my father fill in the blanks himself. Let him convince himself that the things she wanted him to believe were his own thoughts. I moved past the living room and down the hall toward my father's office, my footsteps slow, controlled, listening for any sign that Linda had noticed me. But she was too busy talking, too busy making sure that by the time my father walked through the door, he would already be looking at me like I was a problem that needed to be solved. I pushed open the office door without hesitation, stepping inside and shutting it behind me, staring at the desk in front of me, at the drawers that I had seen my father lock and unlock 100 times before. There were two things I needed: proof and leverage. Linda thought she had erased me from this house, that she had complete control over my father, that nothing I said or did would change the outcome she had already decided. But she underestimated me, just like she always did, because while she had spent the past year making me feel like an outsider, I had been paying attention. I had been listening. I had been watching. And now, for the first time since this whole thing started, I was going to do something about it. I moved to the desk, pulling open the top drawer first, flipping through the papers inside. Nothing important, nothing useful. The second drawer was locked, the one my father always kept important documents in, things he didn't want just lying around. I had seen him open it enough times to know where he kept the key, hidden inside the bottom of his pencil holder, tucked beneath the erasers and loose paper clips. My fingers closed around the small key, and the second it slid into the lock and clicked open, I knew I was right. Inside were files, folders, stacks of paperwork, but I wasn't interested in just anything. I was looking for one thing in particular, something I had heard Linda mention once in a hushed conversation with my father when she thought I wasn't listening. I flipped through the files quickly, skimming the names, the labels, my hands steady even as my heart pounded against my ribs until I found it. A thick folder with Linda's name on the front. I pulled it out, flipping it open, my eyes scanning the pages, and the moment I saw what was inside, I knew I had her. Bank statements, legal documents, paperwork that didn't match up with the version of reality Linda had been selling my father. She had always acted like she was the responsible one, like she was the one keeping everything together, making sacrifices for the family, making sure everyone was taken care of, but the numbers on these pages told a completely different story. She had been taking money from my father's accounts, slowly, carefully, just enough at a time that he wouldn't notice, transferring it into a separate account under her name. This wasn't just about favoritism anymore. This wasn't just about her trying to push me out. She wasn't just trying to replace me in this family. She was trying to make sure that by the time I was gone, my father wouldn't have anything left. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, hesitant, and then a voice from the other side of the door. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned, the folder still open in my hands, and saw Linda standing in the doorway, her expression sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands still gripping her phone like she had just ended the call the second she realized where I had gone. She didn't look surprised, which meant she had been waiting for me to do something like this, but she also didn't look as confident as before, because she knew that whatever was in this folder was something I wasn't supposed to see. I held up the papers, tilting my head slightly. "I don't know, Linda. What do you think I'm doing?" Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe, her entire body tense, like she was calculating her next move, deciding whether to lie, whether to play innocent, whether to turn this into another one of her manipulations. But she didn't have control of the situation anymore. I did. She let out a slow breath, stepping inside and closing the door behind her, lowering her voice like she was trying to regain the upper hand. "You don't understand what you're looking at." I flipped through a few more pages, skimming the numbers, the transactions, all leading to the same account. One that my father's name wasn't on. "Looks like I understand just fine, but I don't think my dad does." She took another step closer, her voice even, controlled. "Put it back." I shook my head, tucking the folder under my arm. "No." Something in her expression shifted, something sharp, something dangerous. "You don't want to do this." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I think I do." She studied me for a long second, like she was trying to figure out if I was bluffing, but I wasn't. I had nothing left to lose, and for the first time in months, I wasn't the one backed into a corner. She straightened her shoulders, her voice dropping lower. "If you tell your father, I'll make sure he never believes a word you say." I met her gaze, holding it steady, my voice unwavering. "I don't need him to believe me. I just need him to see it for himself." For the first time since she had walked into our lives, Linda didn't have a response. And that was how I knew I had one. Linda stood in front of me, her body tense, her eyes scanning my face as she tried to figure out how much I knew and whether there was still a way for her to control the situation. Her hands twitched slightly, like she was resisting the urge to snatch the folder from me, but she knew that would only make her look worse. I could see her weighing her options, deciding whether to beg, threaten, or manipulate me into letting this go. She took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice smooth but firm, like she was speaking to a child who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" She let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it, just controlled frustration. "You don't know the first thing about managing a household, about keeping a family together, about what it takes to make sure everyone is provided for. Your father is a good man, but he doesn't have the best judgment when it comes to money, and if you show him that, you're only going to stress him out over something that doesn't concern you." I didn't blink, didn't move, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing any doubt cross my face, because I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to turn this into something responsible, something necessary, as if secretly transferring money into her own private account was just another part of managing finances, as if what she was doing wasn't betrayal but strategy. I held the folder tighter against my side, shaking my head slowly, keeping my voice steady even though I could feel the adrenaline pounding through my veins. You can try to spin this however you want, but it doesn't change what it is. You've been stealing from him, from this house, from the family you claim to care about, and now you're scared because you know that if he sees this, if he realizes what you've been doing, there won't be a single excuse you can make that will fix it. You think you have him wrapped around your finger, but even he won't be able to ignore proof when it's staring him in the face. Linda's jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. It was only for a second, but it was enough. She wasn't concerned about my father's stress, wasn't worried about how this would affect the family, wasn't acting out of any kind of love or care. She was furious because she had been caught, because I had power now, and because she had spent so long making sure I felt small, making sure I knew my place, making sure I understood that I had no control in this house, and now, for the first time, I was standing in front of her with something that could destroy everything she had built. She took another step forward, lowering her voice, her tone sharper now, less controlled. If you think this is going to end the way you want it to, you're even more pathetic than I thought. You have no idea what your father will do when he finds out. No idea what kind of mess this will create. You want to ruin everything over a few pieces of paper? Go ahead, show him. But don't come crying to me when he decides that having you around isn't worth the trouble anymore. I didn't flinch, didn't let her words get under my skin, because I had already heard the worst of what my father had to say, had already spent months being treated like I didn't belong, had already been pushed to the point where there was nothing left for them to take from me. I stepped back, reaching for the office door, my grip still tight on the folder, my heart still racing, but my voice was calm, steady, even as I stared at the woman who had spent the past year making my life a living nightmare. You've already made sure he thinks that, so I don't really have anything to lose, do I? I walked out without waiting for her to respond, moving through the hallway, past the kitchen, past the living room, ignoring the way my hands were shaking slightly, ignoring the way my breathing was uneven, because I wasn't going to let her see me hesitate, wasn't going to give her any reason to think I was second-guessing myself. I reached the front door just as I heard the sound of keys in the lock, the jingle of metal, the slow creak as the door swung open. My father stepped inside, tired, distracted, his gaze flicking toward me briefly before shifting toward Linda, who had followed me out of the office, her expression carefully neutral, not panicked but prepared, because she had been expecting this, had been waiting for her chance to twist the story in her favor. He sighed, rubbing his temples, his voice already laced with frustration before he even knew what was happening. Okay, what now? I didn't give her the chance to speak first. I stepped forward, holding out the folder, my voice firm even as I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation, waiting for the moment that would determine everything. Before she opens her mouth and feeds you another lie, you need to see this. No excuses, no explanations, just look at it for yourself. Linda let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head like this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding, like I was some dramatic child throwing a tantrum over something I didn't understand. Oh, for God's sake, he's just trying to stir up more problems. He went through your office, by the way, rifled through your things, completely invaded your privacy, and now he's acting like I'm the one who... My father held up a hand, signaling for her to stop, his gaze shifting between the two of us, his exhaustion evident. But there was something else there too, something harder to place, something almost cautious. He hesitated before reaching for the folder, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the documents, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed what he was looking at. Linda stepped closer, her voice softer now, more pleading. Sweetheart, it's not what it looks like. You know how finances can be, you know I've always handled the budgeting, and I was only moving things around too. My father's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto her with a sharpness I hadn't seen in a long time. A sharpness that cut through whatever script she had been preparing. Is this account in my name? Linda hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. My father's grip on the folder tightened, his jaw clenching, his shoulders stiffening, and in that moment, I saw it. The doubt, the realization, the first crack in the blind trust he had always given her. I wasn't sure if it would be enough, wasn't sure if he would finally let himself see what had been happening right in front of him, but for the first time in a long time, I saw something shift, something real, something that told me maybe, just maybe, this was the moment Linda finally lost. My father stood there with the folder in his hands, his expression darkening as his eyes moved across the papers, each page making the muscles in his jaw tighten more. Linda wasn't saying anything now, wasn't smiling, wasn't pretending to be the loving wife who had everything under control. She was standing perfectly still, watching him, waiting, calculating whether she could still find a way out of this. I wasn't sure if he was angry, confused, or in denial, but I knew one thing. He wasn't brushing it aside. He wasn't ignoring it. He wasn't looking at me like I was the problem for once. He finally exhaled, shifting his focus from the documents to her, his grip on the folder firm, his voice even but sharper than I had heard it in a long time. How long has this been going on? Linda blinked, recovering quickly, forcing an easy smile, her voice slipping back into that smooth, controlled tone, like this was all some misunderstanding that could be explained away. Honey, you're overreacting. You know how complicated finances can be. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just moving money around so we could be more secure. I didn't want to bother you with every little detail, especially when you're already so stressed with work. I watched him, waiting, wondering if she had managed to hook him again, if he would let her guide him away from the truth like she always did. But he didn't look convinced. His fingers drummed against the folder once, slowly, before he flipped to another page, scanning the numbers, the dates, the transactions, and when he spoke again, his voice was colder. This account is only in your name. Linda let out a small laugh, shaking her head, stepping closer, reaching for his arm in that soft, affectionate way she always did when she wanted to manipulate a situation, but he pulled back before she could touch him, his eyes narrowing slightly. Of course it is, sweetheart. It's just for emergencies. You know I'd never do anything to hurt this family. I was going to tell you. I just needed to get everything settled first. You've trusted me all this time, haven't you? I could feel the room shifting, the energy changing, the weight of her words not landing the way she wanted them to. My father wasn't nodding, wasn't reassuring her, wasn't giving her an easy way out. He was still staring at the documents, flipping back and forth between pages, shaking his head slightly, like he was piecing something together in real time, like he was finally seeing the cracks he had refused to acknowledge before. That's a lot of money, he said, quieter this time, almost to himself. Why didn't you tell me? Linda's fingers curled into fists at her sides for a brief second before she smoothed out her expression again, tilting her head slightly, her voice softer, more pleading. Because I knew you'd react like this. I knew you'd worry, that you'd think it was something bad when really, I was just trying to protect our future. Everything I do is for this family, for you, for the kids. I don't understand why you're making this into something it's not. I let out a breath, shaking my head, stepping forward before she could start spinning more of her nonsense. She's been taking from you, Dad. This isn't protecting anything. She's been making sure that when she's done with you, she walks away with everything. Linda turned toward me sharply, her voice snapping back into something sharper, more aggressive. You don't know anything about how adults handle responsibilities. You've done nothing but try to turn him against me from the beginning, and I am so sick of it. You have been nothing but a selfish, ungrateful brat, and I have put up with it long enough. I ignored her completely, keeping my focus on my father, waiting for him to look at me, to acknowledge that I was telling him something that mattered, that I wasn't making this up, that I wasn't the problem here. You need to ask yourself why she kept this a secret for so long, why she made sure this account was only in her name. You need to think about why she's trying so hard to control the situation right now. If this was really just about security, why did she need to hide it from you? My father's shoulders were tense, his fingers gripping the folder so tightly that the pages inside crumpled slightly. He wasn't looking at me, wasn't looking at her, just staring at the papers, reading the same numbers over and over again, like he was waiting for them to change, for them to tell him a different story, one that made sense, one that let him believe this wasn't what it clearly was. Linda's voice was sharp now, her patience slipping completely. He's just trying to get back at me. You know how much he resents me, how much he wants to break this family apart. He's always been like this, always playing the victim, always making himself out to be the poor, abandoned son while you work yourself to the bone to provide for him. And this, she gestured toward the folder, her face twisting in frustration. This is just another pathetic attempt to make you choose between us. But you don't have to, because I already know who you'll choose. You'll choose the person who actually cares about you. Something about that struck a nerve in my father. His gaze snapped up, locking onto her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his expression, no exhaustion, no careful consideration of how to keep the peace. There was just realization, just clarity, just something sharp and cold that made Linda take a half step back. Enough, he said, his voice low, controlled, but final. You've said enough. Linda opened her mouth, ready to backtrack, ready to shift her tone again, but he didn't give her the chance. He turned away from her completely, his eyes landing on me, and I braced myself, unsure of what he was going to say, of whether he would lash out at me for exposing this, for putting him in this situation. But the words that left his mouth weren't what I expected. I should have listened to you sooner. Linda's breath caught, her face paling slightly, her fingers twitching like she wanted to grab him, to pull him back into her reality before he slipped away completely, but it was too late. He had already seen what he needed to see, already made the decision he should have made months ago. She let out a breath, shaking her head, her lips pressing together tightly before she exhaled sharply, her voice filled with frustration. You're making a huge mistake. My father closed the folder, exhaling slowly before looking at her one last time, his voice steady. No, I'm finally fixing one. For the first time since she had stepped into our lives, Linda didn't have a response. Linda stood completely still, her hands clenched at her sides, her mouth pressing into a tight line as she processed what had just happened. She had spent so long playing this game, twisting situations, controlling narratives, making herself the victim whenever it suited her, and now, for the first time, she had lost. There was no backup plan, no easy way to manipulate her way out of this, no carefully chosen words that could erase what my father had just seen for himself. She had built her control over him piece by piece, year by year, making sure that by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. But now, all of that was falling apart right in front of her, and she had no idea how to fix it. She let out a slow breath, lifting her chin slightly, her voice softer now, almost careful, like she was making one last attempt to reel him back in. I don't understand why you're acting like this. After everything we've built together, after everything I've done for this family, you're going to let one bitter, angry boy turn you against me? My father didn't respond immediately. He set the folder down on the counter, his fingers still gripping the edges of the papers like he was holding onto something heavy, something difficult to process. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, not as cold as before, but without any of the hesitation that had always been there when it came to her. This isn't about him. This is about you. This is about the fact that you've been taking money behind my back, about the fact that I trusted you to handle things honestly, and you lied to me. Linda's shoulders stiffened, and for a second, I thought she might break down, might start crying, might try to play the wounded wife, the misunderstood woman just trying to do what was best for the family. But she didn't. She must have realized that it wouldn't work this time, that my father had already decided what this meant, that no amount of tears would change what was on those papers. So instead, she straightened her spine, crossing her arms, her voice turning sharp again, her anger slipping through the cracks in her control. I did what I had to do, she snapped, her eyes flashing with something closer to rage now. Do you think I enjoyed having to take care of everything while you worked yourself into the ground? Do you think I wanted to be the only one making sure this family stayed together while you ignored what was right in front of you? You don't get to act like I'm the villain here when all I've ever done is clean up your mess. My father stared at her, his expression unreadable, his silence dragging out long enough that for a brief moment, I thought maybe she had gotten to him again. Maybe he was still trying to convince himself that there was some version of this where she wasn't what she so clearly was. But then, he took a slow breath, exhaled heavily, and turned away from her completely, shaking his head as he rubbed a hand down his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. "I want you out," he said, his voice low, steady, final. Linda flinched, her body stiffening, her lips parting slightly like she hadn't actually considered that this could be the outcome, like she had been so sure that no matter what, my father would always choose her in the end. But now, as she stood there, watching him pull out his phone, scrolling through his contacts, she finally understood. "This is my house," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but not with fear, with rage. "No," my father said, not even bothering to look at her. "It's mine." Linda's hands curled into fists, her face twisting in anger, but before she could say anything else, my father put his phone to his ear, stepping away from her, pacing toward the other side of the room. I couldn't hear the exact words, but it was clear enough that he was making arrangements, calling someone to come help him, to make sure that she didn't have a choice in the matter. Josh and Emma had been silent this whole time, watching everything unfold from the hallway, their expressions unreadable, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way Emma kept shifting on her feet like she wanted to say something but didn't know what. I wasn't sure if they were angry, scared, or just confused about how everything had fallen apart so fast. I didn't care. They had watched me get pushed out, ignored, treated like nothing, and they never said a word. Never cared that I was sleeping in a basement while they lived like royalty. They had never been on my side, and I wasn't about to start pretending like I cared about theirs. Linda turned toward them now, her voice snapping sharply. "Go pack your things." Josh hesitated, his lips pressing together tightly before he finally nodded, walking away without another word. Emma, on the other hand, stayed put, her eyes darting between me and my father like she was waiting for one of us to say something, like she thought there was still time for someone to change their mind. "But where are we supposed to go?" she asked, her voice small, uncertain. Linda didn't answer. She just stood there, shoulders tight, her hands still shaking slightly at her sides. My father didn't answer either. He just kept talking into the phone, making arrangements, making sure this was actually happening. I should have felt guilty. Maybe the old me would have. Maybe there was a version of myself that would have worried about where they would end up, about whether they would be okay. But I had spent too long being invisible in my own home, being treated like I was disposable, like I was just a temporary problem that would eventually go away. And now, finally, they were the ones being pushed out. Linda let out a sharp breath, shaking her head, and turned toward me, her expression dark, furious. "I hope you're happy," she hissed. "You got exactly what you wanted." I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat, because this wasn't about revenge, wasn't about winning some kind of game. This was about taking back something that had been stolen from me. "I didn't want any of this," I said, my voice calm, even. "I just wanted my home back." Linda stared at me for another long second before finally turning on her heel, storming past me, heading toward the stairs without another word. I could hear her footsteps pounding against the floor as she moved through the house, shoving things into bags, slamming drawers, pulling clothes from closets. She was furious, she was humiliated, she was unraveling. And for the first time since she had come into our lives, there was nothing she could do about it. It took less than an hour before they were gone. The house was quiet after that, almost too quiet, like the air itself had shifted, like something heavy had finally been lifted. My father sat down on the couch, rubbing a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He looked up at me, his expression tired but something else too, something like regret. "I should have seen it sooner," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I turned away and walked toward the stairs, heading up to my old room, the one that had been stolen from me, the one I had been forced to give up. I opened the door, stepped inside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I actually belonged. This was my home again, and no one would ever take it from me.